Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I'd like to thank Ethos Media for inviting the RGA to speak at this conference. I'm sure it will be a great opportunity for us to present the views of the online gambling industry with regard to the situation in Europe and in particular of the legal situation in Greece. I'd like to start with a presentation of the Remote Gambling Association. The RGA is the largest trade association for the European online gambling industry, with 30 members. You will see the full list in a minute. All the RGA members must be licensed for gambling purposes within Europe, and they must comply with a strict code of conduct on social responsibility. I think it's important to stress that the RGA has never regarded self-regulation as a substitute of legislation, but only as a complement. I'm saying that because some incumbent operators claim that the private operators are not interested in self-regulation, and that's not true. Therefore, the RGA encourages high standards of probity and integrity, and will represent the industry in international and European fora, and also at national level within the EU member states through a network of consultants and lawyers. And we have offices in London and Brussels. Here you can see the full list of members. The majority of them are online gambling operators, although there are also some software providers. Most of the famous and reputable operators in Europe are part of the RGA, and I think that at least those that would be interested in obtaining a Greek license are members of the RGA. I would like to continue with a presentation of the EU legal framework. First of all, and for those that are not familiar with EU law, you have primary EU law, which are the EU treaties, and then you have secondary legislation, which implements the rules of the treaty. The rules of the treaties do apply to gambling. And in this particular, we should refer to Article 49, which concerns freedom of establishment, Article 56 on the freedom to provide services, but there are also other provisions in the treaties that are relevant for gambling, like Article 107 on state aids. Additionally, there is secondary legislation, which implements a large number of policies, although online gambling is excluded from most of them. That's the case of the Services Directive and the E-commerce Directives, which are the most relevant pieces of legislation for cross-border provision of online gambling services. There are exceptions to this, of course, like the Anti-Money Laundering Directive, which applies to casino games. For the RGA, this is unfortunate. We have always advocated the inclusion of gambling within the scope of EU secondary legislation. And another unfortunate example of this exclusion is the Consumer Rights Directive. The Commission tabled a proposal which included gambling within the scope, but due to the pressure of some member states in the EU Council, gambling was finally excluded, which means that European gambling consumers don't have the protection of this piece of legislation. There is no specific EU instrument dealing with gambling, and this is mainly due to the pressure from the member states. A considerable number of countries have made it very clear to the European Commission that they don't want a directive on gambling, and for this reason the European Commission has not presented, or has not tabled so far any specific proposal. However, there seems to be a momentum. The European Parliament adopted only a few weeks ago a resolution which could pave the way for some kind of common standards, at least with regard to consumer protection. And I think I should refer as well in this context to the European Commission's Green Paper on online gambling, which seeks to steer debate on the issue of online gambling, the main problems at EU level, and what are the next steps. And in fact, the European Commission for the Internal Market and Services, Michel Barnier, announced only last week that the European Commission would present by mid-2012 a communication on online gambling, which could be a first step on some kind of common standards for online gambling, at least with regard to consumer protection. But the conclusion of all this is that member states decide how to organize gambling activities, but they have to do so in compliance with EU law. So member states do not have a free hand when it comes to gambling policies. I think it's never stressed enough that the general rule under EU law is that an operator which is legally established in one EU member state can offer its services across the EU. Unfortunately, in the case of online gambling, that's more the exception than the norm, because there are many restrictions. Of course, the most blatant restriction will be a blanket ban, but this is quite exceptional. Right now, there are very few countries that have a blanket ban, as we will see shortly in a map of the European countries. There are also countries which have a state-run monopoly, but what we're seeing is a trend towards license regimes. But even the fact of requiring an additional license in a member state where the consumer is located is in itself a restriction to the free provision of services. The Court of Justice of the European Union has established case law on this specific issue, and any restriction must fulfill a number of requirements. First of all, it must be justified by overriding reasons of general interest, for instance, consumer protection or fighting fraud or crime. However, the maintenance of tax revenues is not a valid justification. It must also be, that restriction must be suitable to attain the pursued objective. It must be proportionate in the sense that there shouldn't be other means less restrictive that will enable to attain the same objective. It must be non-discriminatory, meaning that it shouldn't place local operators or incumbent operators in a more favorable situation. And it should be consistent with the pursued objective. And in this respect, I think we must remember that any gambling policy that introduces restrictions allegedly to protect consumers should not try to encourage consumers to gamble. The European Court of Justice has indicated on several occasions that any restriction should be consistent and systematic with the general objectives. It is true that the Court of Justice has admitted control expansion, but it's difficult for a member state to have a wide range of gambling operations run by the monopoly or by the incumbent operator, and at the same time impose restrictions on operators from other EU countries, claiming that the purpose of those restrictions is to protect consumers. There is a clear trend within the EU, as I mentioned a moment ago, moving from semi-public or state-run monopolies on gambling to license regimes. And there are two reasons for this. One of them is purely legal, the fact that the European Commission has launched infringement proceedings against a considerable number of member states for the restrictions, and of course also the case law of the Court of Justice. And the second element I would say is just being pragmatic, and the fact that consumers want to play online, and they demand a wider variety of products. And it's also more and more difficult for the national authorities to prevent consumers from playing with the operators of their choice. There are measures or mechanisms like ISP blocking or financial transaction blocking, but they only have a limited effect. So I think that as a consequence of these two elements, many countries have realized that the best option for them is to go from a monopoly or a blanket ban and move to a license regime. You can see what I just said in this map. As you can see, there are very few countries that have a blanket ban, and even Germany, which appears in red, has notified to the European Commission draft legislation on gambling, which actually provides for a license regime. So probably the Netherlands will be the only country within the European Union which has an explicit blanket ban on online gambling. In the Nordic countries, where there is a long tradition of monopolies, on other areas as well, there is still monopoly on online gambling, and in Portugal as well. But in the other European countries, there is a license regime which is more or less viable. The fact that the member state decides to introduce a licensing regime does not imply that it's going to work. And actually, there are countries where there is a licensing regime, but very few operators have shown interest, like France. So I think we all agree that any legal framework should protect consumers, should try to minimize underage gambling, problem gambling, and should provide for a mechanism to fight fraud and crime. But at the same time, if we want that the system works, there should be a level playing field for all operators, and for the entrants and for the incoming operators. There should be no duplication of requirements. And in this respect, I think it's important there is more mutual trust between member states. But for the industry, there's no point in requiring the same condition twice. If a member state requires certain technical standards, for instance, and those standards are exactly the same in another jurisdiction, we don't see why the operator should comply twice with those requirements. There should be enough mutual trust between member states, and at least there should be recognition of those standards which are almost identical. As an example, I can give you the server requirement. If an operator has a server located in one member state which is subject to the strict requirements of that jurisdiction, we don't see why other jurisdictions should require an additional server. They should have access to the information in the primary server in the member state of origin, and that should be enough. We also believe that there should be a wider scope of products, so it shouldn't be limited to a particular product, like, for instance, sports betting, or only a particular part of sports betting. And finally, a very important element, of course, is taxation, which should be based, in our opinion, on GGR and gross gaming revenues, and not on turnover tax. And I'm sure that the representative from KPMG will refer to this later today. After this introduction of the situation in Europe, I'll refer specifically to the situation in Greece. Probably most of you are aware that the European Commission launched an infringement proceeding against Greece in 2007. The latest stage in the procedure before reaching the European Court of Justice was reached in 2008, when the European Commission sent a recent opinion. This case has not been closed, it's still pending, although it refers to the previous situation where there was a monopoly on land-based activities and there was a blanket ban on online activities. Additionally, as you are probably aware of, there are two rulings of the Court of Justice of the European Union concerning electric and electronic games, including slot machines outside casinos, from 2006 and 2009, and also the European Commission decision on a state aid case concerning the different admission tax or entrance fee in casinos. So I think that these three examples show that the Greek legislation has some problems with EU law. There are also other pending cases which will probably clarify the situation from a EU perspective, like the cases brought by Stanley Bet against the Greek legislation. As regards the new law adopted in August of this year, in a nutshell, we will say that it maintains OPAP's monopoly for virtually all offline activities, and it replaced the blanket ban on online gambling by a license regime. The RJ has been in contact with the Greek authorities from the beginning of the discussions concerning the review of the gambling legislation, and we'd like to welcome the openness and the willingness to speak with us and to discuss certain elements. It is definitely possible that Greece has finally decided to open its market and to introduce a licensing regime. We think that the requirements concerning technical standards are reasonable. We're also happy about the shift in taxation, which originally was based on turnover tax and now is GGR. And the law rightly acknowledged demand for a wide variety of gambling products. However, there are also very negative elements in it. And the RGA has consequently decided to lodge 2 separate complaints to the European Commission. One of them is based on competition grounds, because we consider that the different tax treatment of OPAP and private operators represents state aid. I think it's important in this context to refer to the European Commission's decision on the Danish state aid case. For those of you that are not familiar with this case, the land-based sector in Denmark lodged a complaint against the different tax treatment of offline and online activities in Denmark. And the European Commission finally considered that this different tax treatment represents indeed a state aid, but is justified because of the positive effects of the liberalization of the online gambling market in Denmark, and also because the land-based sector is subject mainly to competition from other land-based outlets, while the online gambling industry is subject to competition from the entire world, and it's important to channel local consumers to licensed operators. Our complaint against the Greek legislation on competition grounds tackles 2 elements. One of them is the fact that while OPAP is exempted from paying GGR on gambling operations, online gambling operators will have to pay 30%, which is indeed a very high rate if you compare it to what's happening in other countries, like in the UK, where it's 15%, or Denmark 20%, or 25% in Spain. We are not saying, or we're not arguing that offline and online activities should be taxed with the same rate. We're just saying that any difference should be justified, and we don't see any justification for this, not even different tax treatment. I mean, the fact is that OPAP's activities will be simply exempted from any tax. And the second element is the 10% withholding tax on customer winnings from online gambling. While again, there will be an exception for OPAP's activities when the winnings are up to 100 euros. The RGA also lodged a separate complaint on internal market grounds. It was actually done yesterday. And this complaint addresses a wider range of issues. I mean, you can see all of them there. The non-transparent extension of OPAP's concession for 10 years. And there is very clear case law of the Court of Justice indicating that any concession should be transparent and should allow all interested parties to intervene. That was not the case here. There is also the element of the possible retroactive taxation of online gambling, going back to 1st January 2010. Also the possible separate requirement in Greece. The limitation on the number of licenses, which is still not clear. The seat of permanent establishment in Greece, which is a blatant restriction to the free provision of service, and it's actually its negation. Also, tender procedure only open to capital companies and not to other companies with a different legal form. The identification of players and the requirement to have a player card, which we see as a burden when compared to the offline sector, which is not subject to that requirement. Also, the financial transactions exclusively via Greek banks or Greek branches. Imposing a higher age limit for online than for online gambling. Well, here I'm referring to sports betting. And finally, disproportionate criminal sanctions, which could go up to 10 years imprisonment. There is also, although this is not addressed in any of the complaints, there is also uncertainty as regards OPAP's intentions with regard to the online gambling market. What are the conclusions? From what we have seen, I think it's hard to deny that the Greek legislation has had problems in the past with EU law, and we think that's still the case, despite all the improvements that have been made. We are satisfied with the fact that the Greek authorities have finally decided to open the market, but we think that it's necessary to work on the current legal framework to make it EU compliant and also to make it attractive to consumers so that they are channeled to a safe and attractive offer with licensed operators. Thank you very much.